Hello and welcome back to Koala Moon, children's bedtime stories and meditations designed to make bedtime a dream. Now it's time to meet our little ducky duo. This is The Lazy Duck's Rainy Day by Luke Prendergast. On a gentle bend of Sleepy River, which meanders its way slowly through Sleepy Forest, lived two young ducks. They had bright white feathers, golden beaks, and little yellow webbed feet. They were sisters, and their names were Bread and Butter. Bread and Butter lived in a nest made out of twigs and leaves, snuggled right down among the dense reeds that grew on the banks of the river. Anyone who happened to be walking along the riverside would no doubt spot Bread and Butter sailing up and down on the river, kicking their yellow webbed feet and quacking merrily at each other as they went. One early morning, Bread, who was the older of the two sisters, but only by a couple of minutes, was just waking up. There was a cool, silvery light breaking in through the roof twigs of their nest, and her sister Butter was still rousing herself out of sleep beside her. Bread stretched her wings wide, poked her head out of the top of her nest, and was delighted by what she saw. It was raining. Little droplets of rain fell from the sky, making their plip-plip-plop sound on the river water, like the tinkling notes of a xylophone. Water could be heard dripping from the leaves of the trees and pattering down like tiny little footsteps on the mulchy ground. "Butter, wake up!" Bread quacked for joy. "Wake up, wake up!" Butter, who often found that her sister didn't want to get moving in the morning, gave a big yawn. "Ooh, what is it?" she said. But Bread wouldn't tell her. "Just come and see," she quacked. "Quickly!" Butter rubbed the sleep from her eyes, pulled herself up, and poked her head out of the nest like her sister did. "Oh, Bread!" she quacked. "What a day! Why didn't you tell me? It's a rainy day." For the truth was, there was nothing that Bread and Butter enjoyed more than a lazy, rainy day on Sleepy River. While some creatures might not like the rain because it got their feet wet or their fur damp or splashed in their eyes, that was not the case for these two sisters. With their waxy feathers and flippery feet, ducks were in their element in the rain. They didn't say, "Water off a duck's back," for nothing, after all. As they ate their breakfast of toast and seeds and pulled on their bright yellow bucket hats, Bread and Butter chatted about how they would spend their rainy day. They agreed that they would spend a lot of time floating up and down the river, enjoying the rain. "And we could make a big splash and have a water fight," suggested Bread, who was the more energetic of the two sisters. I'm not sure about that," replied Butter, who didn't really like to overexert herself very much at all. "I'd really like a lazy day. We can find a nice quiet corner in the rushes and just sit there, enjoying the drizzle." Bread picked up her bright green umbrella, the most fashionable item she owned. One of the reasons she loved rainy days was because she got to take it out with her. "Well," she said, "let's head out and see." So the two sisters waddled out of their nest and hopped from its twiggy edges onto the gently drifting currents of the river. "Oh, isn't this wonderful?" Bread sighed as she felt the cool water running over her feathers. "Just the best kind of day," Butter agreed. Bread and Butter floated down the river, enjoying the sound of the falling rain, which they thought was like a forest orchestra coming to life. Soon enough, they reached an area where the river current slowed down and collected into a wide pool. "Look what I can do," Bread said to her sister. "Are you watching? Are you sure?" And when she was sure that Butter was watching, Bread took a big gulp of air and stuck her head under water so that she was upside down, half submerged, with her little yellow feet flapping this way and that in the air. Butter couldn't help but let out a big quacking laugh. Her sister looked so funny upside down in the water. When Bread turned the right way round again, she shook her head so little droplets of water were flung in an arc, and told Butter that now it was her turn. "Go on," she encouraged her, "and make sure you flap your feet extra fast." Butter took a big mouthful of air, counted to 3, and stuck her head under the water. Now it was Bread's turn to laugh, looking at Butter's feet waving about in the air like that. And when Butter came back the right way round, the two sisters laughed and quacked together, because rainy days were so much fun. Then, to their great surprise, a sparkling orange and white koi carp stuck his head out of the water. "Hello, my ducks," he said. Bread and Butter flapped their wings in greeting. "Oh, hello, Koji," they quacked, recognizing their good friend. "How are you on this rainy day?" Very fine, said Koji the koi carp. "Can't be complaining, not with this glorious weather like this." Bread and Butter looked up at the sky. They couldn't agree more. Koji the koi carp said that he had seen the two sisters ducking their heads under the water and had wondered if they were going for a dive. "A dive?" repeated Bread curiously. "What do you mean?" A dive, Koji explained, was when you kicked down all the way beneath the water to see what was down below. "There are some beautiful pebbles on the riverbed," he said. "I can show you if you like." As far as Butter was concerned, diving sounded like quite a strenuous, energetic activity for what was supposed to be a very lazy, rainy day. But her sister's face was lit up with such bright joy at the prospect that she said, "Okay, Koji, show us." So, Koji the koi carp showed the sisters that if they ducked their head under the water like they had before, and then kicked with their yellow-webbed feet, then they'd be able to swim down to the riverbed. "Let's give it a go," he said. The sisters, this time in unison, took a big gulp of air, ducked their heads under the surface of the water, and kicked. What fun it was, Bread thought, as she propelled herself through the water, feeling its cool touch slipping over her feathers. Even Butter thought to herself, as she swam down, that diving was fairly exciting, even if it was a little like hard work. Koji showed them all the way down to the riverbed and pointed out plenty of pretty little stones, glittering black onyx, pink quartz, little white ones that looked like tiny eggs. Butter found a turquoise stone and a bright blue one that looked like a little piece of fallen sky, and she picked them up with her beak and slid them under her yellow bucket hat to keep them safe. They'd look very nice as decorations for the nest, she thought. Back at the surface, Bread and Butter thanked their friend Koji the koi carp for showing them what fun diving in the rain was. "No problem, my ducks," said Koji, before, with a swish of his long silvery tail, he swam away. Bread and Butter continued on down the sleepy river. Bread thanked Butter for going diving with her, and Butter told her it was no problem at all. "What would you like to do now, on this lazy, rainy day?" Bread asked her sister. Butter twitched her beak thoughtfully, considering her options. "I think I'd like to go and perch in a tree," she said, "and watch the rain falling into the river from above." Bread thought that sounded like a lovely plan, but she hoped that they wouldn't be doing it for too long, or else she might get bored. But she said to Butter, "What a wonderful idea!" And with a flap of their wings, the two ducks rose from the river and flew up through the falling rain until they came to rest on the branch of a big sycamore tree. They gave their feathers a flap to dispel the water, but just as they were folding them up on their backs, they heard a long, slow voice. "Oh, hello," it said. "Welcome to my tree." The sisters looked up along the branch and caught sight of their new companion. It was Fudge the sloth, and the reason they hadn't spotted her before was because she wasn't sitting on the tree branch. She was hanging below it. "Oh, hello there," Bread said. "I hope we haven't disturbed you." "We were only coming up here," Butter explained, "to sit quietly and contemplate the rain." "Not at all," Fudge replied at length. "I always welcome company." Bread was cocking her head at the sloth curiously. She wondered why she was always sounding like she was forgetting what she was saying halfway through saying it. "Why are you hanging upside down?" she asked. "Oh," Fudge replied, "because I find that it's much more comfortable when you enjoy dozing like me to be off your feet rather than on them." Butter, who also enjoyed dozing, had her interest piqued. "Is that so?" she asked. "Why, yes," said the sloth. "If you don't believe me, you should try it." "Okay then," quacked Butter. "I will." And so Butter gripped the branch tightly with her yellow-webbed feet, and taking courage, swung around on the branch until she was hanging upside down. "Well," yawned the sloth, "what do you think?" Butter had to admit that, in fact, it was very comfortable indeed, and the world looked rather wondrous upside down. The river up above her, where the sky was supposed to be, and the blue-grey sky spread out below her, as though it were the ground. Best yet, the rain now seemed to fall upwards, shooting up from the sky below and landing in the river up above. How marvellous! "You have to try this," Butter told Bread. And so Bread grasped her feet around the sycamore branch and spun around to meet her sister. "What do you think, Bread?" Butter asked. "Well," said Butter, "I have to say, it's more fun than I was expecting it to be." The two sisters stayed hanging very peacefully off their branch, taking in slow, long drawn-out words with the sloth, and enjoying watching the world go by, upside down. But soon all the blood went to their heads, and they began to feel a little bit dizzy. "Time to carry on with our lazy rainy day, don't you think, Bread?" Butter asked her sister. "I couldn't agree more," Bread replied. Both ducks swivelled round on their branches and, thanking the sloth ever so much for showing them just what a topsy-turvy world looked like, they took off from the sycamore branch and sailed gently through the falling rain, landing in 2 little splashes on Sleepy River. The day was getting on. Although the sun was hidden behind the big mushroom-like rain clouds, Bread and Butter could tell by the colour of the light that it was the afternoon. They had been having a very lazy day indeed. Soon they came to the part of the river where a beaver named Buck had recently built a dam. It was a very beautiful part of Sleepy Forest, with riverbanks covered in brightly coloured flowers, and a nightingale who, when it wasn't raining, sang a sweet and melodious song that carried softly through the trees. This afternoon, Buck was relaxing on the veranda at the front of his dam. He was wearing a red and black plaid cap with big ear flaps. When he saw Bread and Butter come sailing around the river bend, he got up and leant over the balcony. "Howdy there, Bread and Butter," he called out, for they were old friends. "Taking a trip down the river on this fine and rainy day, are we?" Bread and Butter flapped their wings and said yes, indeed they were. "How about you both come up here and have a relax on my veranda? I can put the kettle on, we can have a cup of tea, and a little something to eat." "Oh, yes, please," said Bread. "I am feeling rather peckish," said Butter, and all 3 of them laughed at her joke. Bread and Butter flapped their wings and rose into the air, alighting on the veranda of Buck's dam. It was a very impressive dam indeed, with intricate carvings and decorations. Buck had built it all himself, with his hammers and nails and his sharp front teeth. "Now," Buck said, while the 2 ducks got settled, "what shall I make you for lunch? How does some toast sound?" "There's nothing I like more than a slice of toast," Bread told him. "As long as there's plenty of butter," her sister added. Bread and Butter sank into the bean bags that Buck had lying out on his veranda. There they sat, watching the peaceful dripping of the drizzle, while inside they could hear the sound of a kettle boiling and the crunch of toast as it was cut with a knife. Soon enough, Buck came back out, balancing a tray on his paws. He handed the sisters a cup each and poured hot steaming tea from a perfect porcelain teapot into them. The teapot had a tea cosy on it that made it look like a duck, and the sisters quacked with laughter. "Look, Butter," said Bread, "it's you." "Oh no, Bread," said Butter. "I think it looks much more like you." Then Buck handed them a plate of richly buttered toast and an extra little jug with an unfamiliar liquid in it. Bread sniffed the jug. It smelled sweet. "What's this?" she asked. "That," Buck replied, "is maple syrup. I made it myself from the sap I collected from the maple tree, right here in Sleepy Forest. Have a taste, it's a real treat." "There's really no way I prefer to spend a lazy day," Buck said, kicking back and taking a slurpy sip of his tea, "than having a warm cup of tea, a bite to eat, and some gentle conversation with some good friends. Don't you think?" Bread and Butter said they agreed wholeheartedly. They told Buck about their day, about how they'd gone diving with Koji the koi carp, even though that was a little more energetic than Butter liked to be on a rainy day. And then how they'd hung upside down in the sycamore tree with Fudge the sloth. even though Bread was worried she might get a little bored. They agreed, however, that sitting there with Buck on his veranda, watching the rain fall slantingly and the river trickle past them beneath them, was the best of both worlds. It wasn't too demanding for Butter, but it was interesting enough to keep Bread from nodding off accidentally. It was, in a word, just perfect. They chatted merrily and watched the rain. They finished their tea and their buttered toast with maple syrup. Buck even went back inside to get a box of shortbread biscuits, which they nibbled over together. "Thank you, Buck," Bread said. "You've been ever so generous and kind. I wish we had something to give you in return." And just as Bread was saying this, Butter had an idea. "We do have something to give you," she said. And she took her yellow bucket hat off her head and tipped it upside down. From within tumbled the 2 beautiful pebbles she'd gathered from the riverbed, one of the deepest turquoise, the other such a bright blue it looked like a little piece of the sky. "These are for you," Butter said to Buck, handing him the pebbles. "They'll be a pretty decoration for your dam." Buck took the pebbles in his paw, thanking the sisters over and over again. He was very touched by their gift. "I know just where they'll go," he told them. "They'll look beautiful on my windowsill. Now," he added, "who'd like another cup of tea?" And so Bread and Butter sat on Buck's veranda while he made another cup of tea. And when he came out, they talked about all kinds of things. They watched the clouds shift and change in the sky, turning deep purple as they filled up with rain, then bleaching a light mauve as they emptied their droplets all over the forest. They watched the sun sinking behind the clouds, turning the sky first a pale grey, then a dark indigo, and finally black. Finally, Bread turned to her sister and said, "Come on, Butter, it's our bedtime now." "Oh, you're right," said Butter, yawning. "It really is." They thanked Buck again for his generous hospitality, and then they swam back up the sleepy river to where their snug home was nestled among the reeds. They took off their bucket hats and shook their wings dry. They brushed their beaks and pulled on some warm socks to sleep in. As they were nuzzling down into bed, Butter said to her sister, "That was the best rainy day we've ever had, don't you think?" "Oh, yes," said Bread. "The best lazy rainy day ever." They were both yawning now. For a lazy day it had still been a pretty tiring one. "Good night, Bread," said Butter. "Good night, Butter," said Bread. And then the 2 ducks, sisters and best friends, closed their eyes and began to drift off. And little did they know it, but their final thoughts before sleep took them were the same. What, they wondered as they fell asleep, would the weather be like tomorrow? This is The Owl and the Pussycat by Jane Thomas. Ollie and his brother Oscar live at the very top of a very tall, very grey building. Sometimes their home is so high in the sky that they live above the clouds, looking out onto a rolling world of white. But on days when it's clear, they can see for mile after mile, looking across at all the other very tall, very grey buildings. Oscar and his brother Ollie live on the edge of one of the largest cities in the world. If they look out of the windows on the right side of their home, all they see is a sea of grey and concrete. But if they look out of the windows on the left side of their home, they can see the smooth billows of green hills leading up to purple mountains that disappear into the sky. They count themselves as very lucky indeed, because they are one of the few homes in this city that has such a wonderful, endless view. They share their home with their parents and, perhaps even more importantly, their large grey cat called George. George is something of a giant, a huge ball of a cat who likes to leap from Oscar's lap to Ollie's lap and back again, snuggling into their hugs and purring softly as their fingers ripple through his fur. When Oscar and Ollie go out to school, George spends his time curled up on the windowsill, looking out at the green world that stretches forever into the distance. From his great height, everything is made miniature, and he isn't quite sure how large the duck pond really might be, or whether the trees are as tall as him or as tall as Oscar or, goodness, even taller than that. And at night, George sometimes sleeps on the end of Oscar's bed, and sometimes sleeps on the end of Ollie's bed, and sometimes he returns to the windowsill to look out over the silent world. Everything is so much more peaceful at night. There are no cars sending the noise of their honking horns drifting up to him, and no ambulances with sirens, and no groups of schoolchildren shouting as they set off home. At night, after the street lights have been dimmed, after everyone in every room in every building has gone to sleep, there is a stillness to the world. George loves the night time for the stillness and for the visits from his friend. Barnaby sometimes swoops by to see George, his long wings white against the black of the night. It's odd that a cat and an owl should be friends, but friends they are. George tells Barnaby everything Oscar and Ollie learned in school each day, and Barnaby tells George all about the world he has only ever seen but never visited. Thanks to Barnaby, George has become very good at imagining the feel of grass beneath his paws, the scent of flowers in the air, and the way droplets of water might hang, gleaming with rainbows from his fur. On this night, a particularly still and clear night, when a million stars light up the sky, and it seems as if the moon has had an extra polish, George is telling Barnaby all about a poem that Oscar learned in school. It's all about, he tells him, an owl and a cat. Barnaby pricks up his ears. This sounds much more interesting than the complicated sums George had tried to explain a few nights ago. To be honest, Barnaby hadn't been quite convinced that George really understood what he was talking about, but he was far too polite to mention this to his friend. But a poem was right up Barnaby's street. He loved the music of poetry, and one about an owl and a cat was definitely going to be one worth listening to. He settled onto his perch and listened as George recited the lines. The owl and the pussycat went to sea in a beautiful pea-green boat. They took some honey and plenty of money wrapped up in a 5-pound note. Barnaby sighed. It sounded wonderful. In his mind's eye, he pictured George sat at one end of a little sailing boat, and him at the other. With a start, he realized he'd missed a few lines. They sailed away for a year and a day to the land where the bong tree grows, and there in the wood a piggy-wig stood, with a ring at the end of his nose. Barnaby started wondering where they might find a bong tree, for he had certainly never seen a tree with such a name, and he'd never met a pig with a nose ring. But if humans could have them, why not pigs? George hadn't slowed down for Barnaby's wandering mind, and so he listened in again and heard the final lines. They dined on mince and slices of quince, which they ate with a runcible spoon. And hand in hand, on the edge of the sand, they danced by the light of the moon, the moon, the moon. They danced by the light of the moon. George sighed as he finished the poem and looked across at his friend. "Doesn't it sound wonderful?" he said. Barnaby nodded. "We could make it happen, you know," he said thoughtfully. "Perhaps not for a year and a day. I think Oscar and Ollie would be terribly upset if you disappeared for that long. But yes, I know where we could find just such a boat." George looked across at his friend. His paws kneaded the concrete beneath, and he imagined trailing them over the side of a boat and feeling the sea. He thought about seeing rings in pigs' noses and finding out what a bong tree looked like, and stared at his paws to try and work out how they might hold whatever a runcible spoon might be. "Do you think we can be back by dawn?" he said at last. The night was as beautiful a night as he had ever seen. It seemed to be filled with magic, and was surely the finest night he would ever know to have an expedition in a pea-green boat. "Promise," said Barnaby, sweeping his wing across his heart. If you had known to look across at that building on that very night, you might have seen the white sweep of a barn owl drifting slowly down the side, and behind him, walking first this way and then that as he slowly descended the hundreds of steps that made up the wrought iron fire escape, you would have seen a large grey cat. The cat may be something of a giant, and he may have always known that he could leave at any time by taking this route, but he wasn't a particularly courageous animal and had never left home before. The cat paused every now and then, and the owl would hover in mid-air, seeming to talk with the cat and coax him onwards. And then the cat would continue, paws being placed very carefully and specifically on each and every step. For that is how George and Barnaby descended to the street, and where George felt, for the first time, the grass beneath his paws. It was a tickling softness, firm and giving all at the same time. And the smell was like nothing George had ever known. Barnaby waited patiently while George rolled first this way, then that, arching his back into the grass and stretching his tail into the depths of the green. They went slowly through the park towards the boating lake, where a series of colourful wooden boats lay bobbing gently in the moonlight. Barnaby chose a pea-green boat and, using his beak and a few stiff pulls, managed to untie the knot. George put a tentative paw into the boat, leaping back onto the dock as it wibbled and wobbled under his weight. "It's perfectly safe," reassured Barnaby, standing in the boat and leaning to the left and to the right, showing how it rocked gently back and forth, without ever turning over. George took a single bold leap and jumped into the bows of the boat, burying himself against the boards until the movement had quite stopped. Barnaby showed him which ropes to pull to raise the sail, and together they watched as the huge white sheet gently ballooned in the soft breeze, filling with just enough wind to ease them slowly, so slowly, out across the lake. George looked at the ripples that formed behind them, and how the reflections of the stars moved and danced as they caught on the little waves. The pea-green boat splashed softly through the water, a white line etched around it as it cut through the black. As George became used to the feeling and dared to loosen his grip a little on the ropes, he pointed towards the bag he had hauled down the steps. Barnaby peered inside, smiling to himself as he saw a jar of honey wrapped up in a crisp, clean £5 note. "The guitar, Barnaby, the guitar," said George, and the owl reached in and pulled out the ukulele that Barnaby had borrowed from the corner of Oscar's bedroom. "That's the one. You're supposed to sing to me. It says so in the poem." Barnaby had been daydreaming for that part, and he wasn't quite sure what to sing. So he made up something about a cat and a fiddle and a cow jumping over the moon. And George seemed to like that, so he made up another about how the stars twinkled like diamonds in the sky. George leaned back against the side of the boat and closed his eyes, feeling the breeze dancing through his fur as the little boat sailed gently across the lake. Barnaby's singing and playing was the perfect touch, he thought, and he felt a little shiver of magic race all the way from his whiskers to the very tip of his tail. They stopped abruptly when they came to the shore, the boat having just enough momentum to ease its way onto the beach. George leapt out and felt, for the very first time, the sand beneath his paws. It spilled around and moved strangely, underneath and on his paws, and in his claws all at the same time. Made a brilliant white by the light of the moon, the sand sparkled and shone and shifted and sifted. George buried his nose into it to see what it smelled like, and came up immediately with a huge snort and a sneeze. Barnaby pretended not to notice, busying himself with tying the rope for the boat around a tree. "Is that a bong tree?" asked George, and Barnaby said he supposed it might very well be exactly that, even though he knew perfectly well it was really a glorious weeping willow that was trailing its branches into the edge of the lake. George went and sniffed the tree, breathing in such a beautiful scent of damp, fresh greenness that even the grass, so wonderful only an hour before, seemed dull in comparison. The world was full in a way he had never known. The pair set out through a meadow, heading towards a farm that stood on a hill. Barnaby skimmed over the long grasses, wings outstretched, and George rushed this way and that, pulled in every direction by new scents and smells, with flowers almost calling out to be breathed in. He found stars that had fallen to the ground and formed delicate white petals, and Barnaby told him this one was called jasmine. A complicated-looking flower with twisted petals and yellow tongues and dabbles of pink was honeysuckle. And some tiny purple flowers that stayed close to the ground and grouped together was, Barnaby told George, something called night-scented stock. And George thought this really rather wonderful that Mother Nature had thought to put together some flowers that smelled especially beautiful during the night. It felt for a moment as if everything had been placed there specially for him to find, to show him how much magic there is if we only go even a little way from our front door. And it was a meandering, wandering, slow sort of walk that finally led them to the edge of the farm. Barnaby guided him across to where the pigs lay snuffling in their sleep, and George walked along to where the largest one lay on his side, a huge brass ring glistening in his nose. "It's just as the poem said," whispered George to Barnaby, and was on the point of waking the pig when the owl held up a wing to stop him. "Why do we need to wake him?" asked Barnaby. "He looks so peaceful." And George felt a little silly as he thought back to the poem, and remembered that in it the owl and the pussycat used the ring from a pig's nose to be married by the turkey who lived on the hill. Much as he was very fond of Barnaby, and they would, he hoped, remain best friends for many years to come, he wasn't sure that marriage was on the cards, and perhaps it was best if they skipped that part of the poem. "Oh, I just wanted to ask him something," said George, hurrying to add, "but no, you're right, it really doesn't matter. Let's leave him sleeping. He does look so very happy, curled up there in the hay." George was very glad of his grey fur, hiding his blushes as they walked back down the hill and headed once more towards the beach. "I'm afraid I don't quite know what a runcible spoon is," he said sadly as he unpacked the rest of the things from the bag. "Will this do?" he asked Barnaby, holding up a teaspoon. "I think it's perfect," reassured the owl, pulling the corners of a tartan tea towel that was serving them well as a picnic rug. They dined on mince and slices of quince, which they ate with a runcible spoon, recited George, and hand in hand, on the edge of the sand, they danced by the light of the— "Barnaby, we must dance." George jumped up and pulled Barnaby towards him, and paw holding wing, they danced slowly along the shore. A nightingale landed in the weeping willow and poured its beautiful song into the night, and a frog jumped onto a lily pad and softly added his glorious deep voice to the tune. George had spent many evenings talking with Barnaby and laughing with Barnaby, sharing ideas and thoughts and hopes and dreams. But he had never for a moment imagined that he might one day dance with him by the light of the moon. The big grey cat smiled to himself as he placed his paws carefully on the sand, soaking up every moment and sensation so that he might remember them forever. And as the sky slowly turned from black to the deepest blue, and the stars disappeared one by one, George and Barnaby climbed back into the pea-green boat. Once more, George hoisted the sail, and once more they moved gently through the water, gliding silently towards the other side of the lake, and sending ripples rolling back towards the shore. By the time they reached the side, George's eyes were beginning to close. He had spent many nights awake for hours, looking up at the moon and stars, but he had never been awake for so long and seen and felt so many new things all at once. It was a very tired George who pulled the boat back into the little dock, and a very tired George who set out across the grass damp with dew. He knew he needed to be home before Oscar and Ollie were awake, but he allowed himself to find one more patch of jasmine and breathe in deeply the glorious scent. Barnaby followed as George went up the fire escape, the great grey cat's legs feeling heavier with each and every step. He was so tired now, so very, very tired. Each step felt like 1,000, and he longed to be safely curled up at the end of Ollie's bed, safe against the softness of the blankets. A few more steps, and he would be there. Just one last step. And there, he was back home, and Barnaby was waving goodbye as he disappeared to head towards his cosy nest, buried, warm and safe, in a hole in a horse-chestnut tree. George replaced the things he'd taken, one by one, with the ukulele returned to the corner of Oscar's room, and the honey, or what was left of it, back on the shelf in the kitchen, and the plates he'd used for the quince and the mince placed along with the pile of dishes that stood waiting to be washed. And finally, he padded his way across the soft carpet and jumped onto the end of Ollie's bed, turning himself around and around to make the blankets wrap gently around his body. And whereas before he had always fallen asleep with dreams of possibilities floating through his mind, this time he had his very own memories of dancing with Barnaby by the light of the moon. And that is how he fell asleep, his soft grey fur rising and falling as he breathed in and out, and dreamed those magical dreams of moments that were, and moments that might be, and moments that are only made possible when we let ourselves believe in the infinite wonder of the world. This is Goodnight Tortoise Goodnight Hare by Gillian Rogerson. Every morning when Hare woke up, he would leap out of bed and begin rushing about from one activity to another. He liked to keep himself busy, and there was always something to do, somewhere to be, and so very many things to think about. He had lots and lots of busy thoughts in his head, and he sometimes thought they would fall right out of his floppy ears. One sunny morning, as he was out running, Hare was busy thinking about how much he had to do that day, and his attention was on the road far ahead instead of the ground beneath his feet. He didn't notice a tortoise having a leisurely rest on the grass until he accidentally bumped into him. Hare immediately apologized to Tortoise and attempted to go on his way. Tortoise asked why he was in such a rush. "I have things to do," Hare explained. Many things to do." The tortoise was intrigued and asked Hare what those things were. Hare scratched one of his ears and explained that he had fields to run around, rivers to leap over, and bridges to bound across. And there were lots of other things he had to do too, but he couldn't quite remember what they were at the moment. Tortoise slowly shook his head. "That sounds exhausting. You must sleep well at night after all that exercise." Hare admitted he didn't sleep well at all, because even though his body was tired, his mind was still wide awake with thoughts of what he was going to do the next day. He looked down at the resting tortoise and said, "Isn't everyone like that? Doesn't everyone have a busy mind at night time? Doesn't everyone have trouble sleeping?" "Not everyone," Tortoise replied. "I go to sleep easily, every night." Hare was confused. "But what about all your thoughts? Don't they keep you awake?" Tortoise shook his head and said he'd found a way to clear his mind of busy thoughts during the day, and so, by night time, his mind felt calm and peaceful. Hare gave the little tortoise a confused look before saying, "How can that be? Are you magic? Do you make your thoughts vanish by using a magic wand?" Tortoise chuckled and said he wasn't magic at all. In fact, it was very easy for him to clear his mind during the day, and he was sure Hare could too. Hare still looked confused, so Tortoise suggested Hare spend the day with him so he could show Hare how it worked. Hare agreed to spend some time with Tortoise, but not too much time, Hare said. "I still have a lot of running about to do today." They set off down the road. Hare jumped, hopped and skipped as fast as he could, and was soon far ahead of Tortoise. Tortoise took his time and slowly strolled along. He gazed around him in appreciation of the beautiful day and marvelled at how soothing the sun felt on his shell and head. He stopped to smell some wild roses at the side of the road. Ah, delightful. A butterfly fluttered through the air and landed on the velvety petals of a pink rose. The butterfly opened and closed her wings, displaying beautiful shades of blue and yellow. A slow smile spread across Tortoise's face as he absorbed the wondrous sight of the exquisite butterfly. Hare bounded back to Tortoise and asked if he could speed up, please, because he was going far too slow. "Too slow for what?" Tortoise asked. The question confused Hare, and he wasn't sure how to answer it. His whiskers twitched in confusion. Tortoise gently suggested that instead of him speeding up, perhaps Hare could slow down. Hare's eyes widened in surprise. He said, "Slow down? I never slow down. I'm not even sure I know how to slow down." Tortoise smiled kindly and asked if he could try it, at least once. Hare looked at Tortoise's kind face and began to smile. He said he would try his best to slow down. And Hare did try. He tried very hard. He walked slowly at the side of Tortoise and swung his arms in a relaxed manner. When Tortoise stopped to smell the flowers, Hare stopped too and inhaled the lovely floral perfume coming from the plants. He agreed with Tortoise that it was a wonderful smell. But no matter how hard he tried, Hare just couldn't get his bouncy feet to keep going at a slow pace. Before he could stop them, his feet broke into a run, and he raced along the road at high speed. He went so fast that he ended up 5 fields away from Tortoise. Realizing what he'd done, Hare came to an abrupt stop, turned around, and headed back to Tortoise. He told Tortoise it was impossible for him to move so slowly, and there was nothing he could do about it. "Why don't you follow my lead?" Tortoise suggested. He slowly moved forward, counting his steps as he went. 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. Hare thought it was a peculiar thing to do, but he didn't say anything. Instead, he began to count his steps just as Tortoise was doing. It took him a while to match his fast pace with the tortoise's more leisurely one, but it did happen eventually. It wasn't long before Hare found himself thinking only about his steps and nothing else. Counting his steps was a calming thing to do, and Hare felt himself becoming more relaxed with every step he took. 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. However, a little while later, a few busy thoughts drifted into Hare's mind, and he started to think about all the things he needed to do that day. He began to walk faster and faster. Soon, he broke into a run, and he bounded along the road. Hare felt like he had to keep moving quickly in order to keep pace with the many, many thoughts that were whirling through his mind. Hare stopped at a tree and looked over his shoulder to see where Tortoise was. Tortoise was far away down the road. Hare noticed that Tortoise wasn't alone anymore. He was talking to someone. Hare couldn't make out who it was, but he heard laughter coming from their direction. Feeling curious, Hare headed back to the tortoise to see who he was chatting to. As he got nearer, Tortoise smiled his way and introduced Hare to Jimmy, the field mouse. Tortoise said, "I was talking to Jimmy about his family and asking how his children were getting on. They're growing so fast, but you must know that, Hare. You must have seen them running through the same fields that you run through." Hare shook his head. He barely noticed the fields as he rushed through them every day, let alone anyone else who might be running through them too. With a proud smile on his little face, Jimmy told Hare that his children loved seeing Hare run past them every day. They would wave and try to keep up with his long strides. Hare said, "I'm very sorry, but I've never noticed your children before. I've been going too fast to notice anything at all. But with help from Tortoise, I'm trying my best to slow down. The next time that I'm running through the fields, I will look out for your children and say hello to them. Perhaps they could join me in a jog. I promise not to run too fast." He smiled at Jimmy. Jimmy said his children would love that and thanked the Hare. He bade them farewell and disappeared into the tall grass. Tortoise and Hare continued on their way, Hare doing his best to walk at a steady pace. They strolled into a sun-dappled orchard that was full of apple and pear trees. As they walked under an apple tree, Tortoise stopped and looked at the canopy of leaves above them. Ripe, sun-kissed apples hung heavy from the branches of the tree. Hare, have you ever noticed how many different shades of green there are? Even on this tree there's a wide variety. Look, the underneath of the leaves is much lighter than the top of them, and some of the leaves on the ends of the branches are already starting to turn a pale yellow, a sure sign that autumn is on the way. Can you see the fruit up there? Have you noticed how there's a faint pink blush on the side of the apples that face the sun? It's fascinating, don't you think? Hare glanced at the tree. He thought it looked like all the other trees around them. But as he looked closer, he could see Tortoise was right about the different shades of green. He took his time and counted at least 7 varying tones of the colour, and he realised that each apple differed ever so slightly from its neighbour. He'd never noticed that before about apples. He smiled down at Tortoise and said the apple tree was quite beautiful. Tortoise agreed. They ambled through the orchard, taking their time to inspect each apple and pear tree they came upon. They pointed out interesting things to each other. As Hare stood beneath the pear tree, a small leaf came free from a branch and floated towards him. Hare became transfixed as he watched the leaf sedately dance from side to side on its downward journey. He held his paw out, and the leaf landed right in the middle of it. It was such a simple thing to see, but for some reason it filled Hare's heart with joy. He gave the leaf to Tortoise as a gift. Tortoise thanked him warmly and tucked it inside his shell. Hare had a niggling thought that he should be doing something other than standing in an orchard gazing at trees, but he couldn't work out what that something was. He pushed the niggling thought far from his mind and continued on his walk with Tortoise. Tortoise led him to Primrose Pond and told Hare about the large family of frogs who had made it their home. In the spring, there were hundreds of tadpoles, Tortoise said. Hundreds and hundreds of them. They were fascinating to watch, and they grew into frogs so very quickly. Did you get the chance to see them? Hare shook his head. He'd run past Primrose Pond many times, but had never given the animals who lived there a passing glance. Now that he was learning how to slow down, Hare promised himself he would look out for the tadpoles the following spring, and he'd return every day to see them growing into frogs. The lovely thought made him smile. Tortoise said there were many frogs in the pond, and if they were lucky, some of them might appear and have a chat with them. "Are you happy to stay here a while and wait?" Tortoise asked. "It's a lovely day," I love this time of year, where there's just a hint of autumn in the air. Can you smell it?" Hare wasn't sure what autumn smelt like, but he took a deep breath anyway. Even though he couldn't put a name to the scent, he caught a hint of something wonderful in the air. Was it the aroma of autumn? It was another lovely thought, and the smile on Hare's face grew bigger. He told Tortoise he would be more than happy to sit with him and wait for the frogs. Tortoise began to take some deep, slow breaths. Hare instinctively copied him. He felt more and more tranquil with each relaxing breath he took. They sat at the side of Primrose Pond, with the sun softly warming them. Birds sang a cheery tune from the trees. Bees hummed lazily as they flitted from flower to flower. A gentle breeze caused the lily pads on the pond to drift across the surface a little. Hare's whiskers twitched. He became aware of relaxing smells all around them. He could identify some of the aromas, such as the late summer roses and lilies, but some fragrances were unfamiliar to him. He asked Tortoise if he knew what they were. "Lavender and jasmine," Tortoise began, his voice soft and unhurried. "Marjoram and mint, tarragon and thyme, sage and sorrel, caraway, chervil and chives." The sound of Tortoise's quietly spoken voice caused a pleasant drowsiness to fall over Hare. He lay down on the soft grass and put his paws under his head. His eyes felt heavy, so he decided to close them, just for a little while. Before he knew it, he was drifting off to sleep. A peaceful, relaxing sleep. He was woken up a little later by the sound of water gently splashing. He sat up straight, blinked in surprise, and wondered where he was. Then he remembered. He asked Tortoise how long he'd been asleep. Tortoise smiled at him. "Not long. You've woken up just in time. The frogs have appeared. Did you enjoy your nap?" Hare wasn't used to having naps in the middle of the day, but admitted he felt much better for having had one. It crossed his mind that he should be getting back to his day soon. He was certain he had things to do, lots of things, but at that moment he couldn't recall what any of them were. Whatever distant thoughts were on his mind soon vanished when he saw the playful frogs leaping happily from lily pad to lily pad. The frogs smoothly dived into the water, leaving behind an ever-increasing ripple. Some of the frogs swam closer and chatted to Tortoise and Hare. Hare was surprised to hear how much time the little frogs spent playing in the water. He wondered if he too should spend more time playing and less time rushing about. As they talked about the fun they had every day, the frogs began to chuckle and chortle. Hearing their cheerful laughter made Tortoise and Hare laugh too. Bubbles of happiness popped delightfully in Hare's tummy and his smile grew even bigger than he ever thought possible. He knew he would include much more laughter in his day. As Hare softly considered what he normally did every day, the busy thoughts in his head swiftly returned all at once, as if they'd been waiting to get his attention. Hare suddenly realized he had things to do and places to go. He stood up and brushed some grass off his legs. He told Tortoise he really should be getting back to his day. "Okay," Tortoise said with a slow nod. "If you don't mind, I will come with you. I'd love to see what you do and where you go." Hare said, "I'm heading towards the bridge by Ruby River. You're welcome to join me, but you might not keep up." Then, without another word, Hare hastened away. Tortoise wished the frogs a pleasant day before saying goodbye and ambling after Hare. Hare headed in the direction of the bridge, but instead of walking at his usual pace, his steps became slower and slower. And instead of keeping his eyes on the distant horizon and willing it to get closer as soon as possible, his attention went to either side of him, and he looked more closely at the vibrant flowers and wild herbs. He slowed down even more and inhaled the soothing scents drifting from the plants. Taking deep, slow breaths made his pace slow again, and soon he was walking instead of running. Hare reached the bridge that crossed Ruby River and stepped onto it. He was tempted to rush straight over it and onto his next destination, but there was something about the slow-flowing river below the bridge that made him linger. He sat down in the middle of the bridge and swung his legs over the side of it. He gazed into the water and became lost in the swirling motion of the river as it flowed over and around the ruby-red rocks which had given the river its name. Time slowed down. Hare sighed happily. Before he knew it, Tortoise had appeared at his side. He sat next to Hare and gazed at the river. Hare pointed out the different-shaped rocks below them, and how the water bubbled and trickled in various directions as it went on its journey downstream. Tortoise nodded and pointed out some tiny fish who were half hidden behind some of the larger rocks. An occasional twig or leaf would appear on the surface of the water and would float unhurriedly along it. As they sat there, Hare asked Tortoise about his life and the things he did every day. Tortoise told him how he wandered the forest and fields, taking in the sights and sounds of nature. He noticed the changing seasons and how the days would grow longer in the spring and then shorten as autumn approached. Tortoise loved watching the sun peep through the trees in the morning, and then watching it on an evening as it dipped below the horizon and made the sky turn from blue to soft shades of pink and purple. Hare sighed happily again and said he would take the time to look at nature more. In his soft, slow voice, Tortoise continued talking and described how he'd seen a tiny ladybird landing on a delicate daisy in the meadow, the first lambs of the season leaping joyfully through the fields, the changing display of flowers throughout the forest, from the first snowdrops in spring to the purple heathers of winter, the bright sunshine of a summer's morning, and the enchanting sight of the first snowfall of the year. The two friends stayed on the bridge, gently talking for hours, appreciating the delights around them and enjoying each other's company. They discovered that although they had a lot of differences, they had a lot of things in common too. Soon, the afternoon gave way to evening, and the sky began to grow a little darker. The tranquil song of a nightingale filled the air. It was joined by the low hoot of an owl. Hare became aware of the lateness of the day and told Tortoise he should be returning home to his burrow. "Have you ever slept beneath the stars?" Tortoise asked him. Hare shook his head. He'd never even considered such a thing. Tortoise told him there was a lovely tree very close by, which offered a cosy nook within its exposed roots. They could settle down there for the night and look through the branches to the stars above. He said a beautiful tawny owl often chose that tree for her evening rest, and she sometimes told Tortoise a bedtime story. Maybe that would happen tonight. Hare couldn't think of a more wonderful way to spend his evening, and thanked Tortoise for his offer. They left the bridge and walked towards the tree. It did indeed look very cosy and welcoming. Hare found himself yawning, and his legs became more tired with every step he took. When they reached the tree, Tortoise settled down under it and made himself comfortable. Hare collected some soft moss and tucked it around Tortoise to make sure he was as comfy as he could be. Then Hare settled down next to him. They gazed at the night sky through the wide branches above them. Tortoise pointed out each star as it appeared. Hare had never noticed how bright the stars shone and how twinkly their starlight was. A deep hoot sounded out, and a tawny owl appeared on the branch above. She said hello to the two friends and asked about their day. Hare told her about the wonderful things he'd seen and done. As he talked, feelings of peace and contentment settled on him like a soft blanket. His limbs grew tired, and he let out a long yawn. He looked over at Tortoise and thanked him for such a marvellous day. Tortoise said it was his pleasure, and perhaps they could do the same thing tomorrow, if Hare wasn't too busy. Hare thought that was an excellent idea, and he silently wondered what other delights awaited him the following day. The owl proceeded to tell them a bedtime story, but it wasn't long before she stopped talking, because the two animals below her were fast asleep. She smiled as she looked down at them. In a soft voice, she said, "Good night, Tortoise. Good night, Hare." We're drifting towards dreams now, the happiest, loveliest dreams you've ever dreamt. We're calm and cozy. Your breathing is relaxed and you can feel that lovely weight of the blanket keeping you safe and warm. Aren't you comfy? You are so warm and cozy, so sleepy. As you drift into dreams, count all the things you're grateful for. Let yourself fill up with all of the little moments that made you smile today. See the faces of the people that made you laugh. Think of the things that challenged you. Think of the things you learned and the practice that meant you'll be a little bit better tomorrow than you were today. Think about how warm and cozy and sleepy you are here in your bed. What a day you had. Wonderful things lie ahead for you too. You will have wonderful adventures tomorrow and the next day and the one after that. The whole world is waiting for you. But there's no rush. There's nothing more to do today. All that's left for today is rest, deep, cozy sleep. The most beautiful of dreams are waiting for you now. That's why you're drifting off, gently, into dreamland. So keep breathing slowly. Let yourself get toasty warm. Let your eyelids stay heavy. And know that you are safe. Remember that you are smart. You are brave. You are kind. And you are loved. Think it to yourself. I am smart. I am brave. I am kind. I am loved. You are a dream. When tomorrow comes, you'll face it with a smile, because you are smart, brave, kind and loved. Because you are you, uniquely, wonderfully you. What kind of dream are you drifting towards tonight? You can dream however you want, because your imagination is as wide as the universe. What will you find in tonight's dream? Maybe you'll see your favourite characters. Is that Hector and Sunny over there? Maybe you'll visit the moon, where there's mice eating cheese in the craters. Maybe you'll walk through Sleepy Forest, where Coco the koala is strumming his pink ukulele on the banks of Sleepy River. Let your imagination take you away. Your dreams are all yours, and you deserve the sweetest dreams of all, because you are brave, you are kind, and you are loved. You are brave, you are kind, and you are loved. And you are wonderfully, uniquely you. You are a dream, and it's time to sleep, tucked up in your bed. Breathe slowly and melt into your bed. Isn't it warm and soft and cozy? It's time to rest. Take deep breaths in and out and let yourself relax as you say goodbye to the day. Let your body get even heavier. Let your whole body go floppy. Drift deeper into sleep with every breath and say goodnight. Remember, tomorrow will be a good day because you have a big heart. You are a good friend. You believe in yourself. You know there's nothing better to be than yourself. It's okay to get things wrong. It's okay to ask for help. You can do whatever you set your mind to. Be proud to be different. Be proud of your achievements. Be proud of yourself. You are a good learner. You are a good listener. You are a good example to others. You are valued. You are loved. You are sleepy. So drift off now, little one. Let the dreams take over. As you sleep, let your dreams take you to magical lands and faraway places. Remember, there's no room for worries in your dreams, just magic. It's a magic place where anything can happen, anything you want. It's a place of positivity and light. Let positivity soak into you and fill you up. Imagine it as a golden light traveling from the tips of your toes to the top of your head. Imagine that wherever the light touches you fills with happiness. Imagine that the light makes you feel calm. You're wrapped in a warm, cozy glow within your soft, toasty blanket. Isn't that nice? You are safe, tucked up tight. So sleep soundly all through the night. Sweet dreams, little one.